Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. In the days when the world was younger and the memory of the trees still lingered in the songs of the Eldar, there came to Middle-earth 5 servants of the Valar, clad in the forms of men, yet bearing within them the wisdom of the undying lands. Most know the tales of 3, Saruman the White, chief among them, Gandalf the Grey, friend to the small and forgotten, and Radagast the Brown, shepherd of beast and growing thing. But of the other 2, the blue wizards who journeyed into the uttermost east, little is remembered and less is spoken. Their names were Alatar and Pallando in the tongue of Valinor, though in the lands beyond the Sea of Rhûn, they were called by other titles, Morinetar, the Darkness Slayer, and Romistamo, the East Helper. Long had they labored in regions where no elf lord had set foot since the elder days, where the shadow of Morgoth had fallen deep and the light of the 2 trees was but a whisper in the wind. It was in the year 2851 of the Third Age that the wind first brought word of their fate to those who dwelt in the west. Gandalf the Grey stood upon the battlements of Dol Guldur, newly cleansed of its shadow, and felt a stirring in the air, not of malice returned, but of knowledge long withheld, pressing against the borders of his mind like water against a cracking dam. The autumn leaves of Mirkwood bore strange colours that year, tinged with blue as deep as twilight, and the elves of Thranduil's halls whispered that the very trees seemed to dream of distant mountains where no sun had shone for an age of the world. In Rivendell, Elrond's eyes grew thoughtful as he gazed into his mirror of memory, seeing therein roads that led beyond the edge of his maps into lands where the stars themselves told different stories. But it was Galadriel, fairest and most far-seeing of all who remained in Middle-earth, who first perceived the truth that would shake the foundations of all their understanding. In her mirror in Lothlorien, she beheld a vision that made even her immortal heart grow cold. 2 figures in blue robes, standing at the edge of a great chasm, and beyond them, a darkness that was not the darkness of Sauron, but something older, stranger, and perhaps more terrible still. The water in her mirror rippled, and the vision changed. She saw great cities in the east, built of stone unknown in Gondor or Rohan, where men knelt before altars that reeked of sacrifice and sang hymns to powers that dwelt in the depths of the earth. She saw armies marching beneath banners that bore no device of the eye, but symbols that hurt to look upon, twisted runes that seemed to writhe like living things in the light of braziers fed with more than wood. And in the midst of it all, she saw the 2 blue wizards, but they were changed. Their robes were stained with dust and ash, their faces gaunt with privation and marked by sorrows that even the Istari were not meant to bear. Yet their eyes still held light, not the clear light of Valinor, but something harder, tempered like steel in the forges of despair. They moved like men who had learned to walk in darkness and found their own way to carry flame. Mithrandir, she called, and across the leagues that separated Lothlorien from Dol Guldur, Gandalf heard her voice in his mind, clear as silver bells and urgent as the horn of Gil-galad. Come to me, grey pilgrim. There are tidings that cannot wait for messengers, and a darkness approaches that even the victory over the necromancer may not forestall. Gandalf set down his staff and looked once more upon the ruins of Dol Guldur, where grass was already beginning to grow in the courtyards, where once only shadow had dwelt. The stones themselves seemed to breathe easier now, as if a great weight had been lifted from their ancient shoulders. Yet in the wind that moved through the broken towers, he thought he heard an echo of distant voices, voices that spoke in tongues unknown to the West, calling across the waste places of the world with words that might have been warning or farewell, or perhaps both. He mounted Shadowfax, who had been waiting in the courtyard with the patience of one who knows that great events cast long shadows before them. As they rode westward toward the Golden Wood, Gandalf found his thoughts turning to memories that were not his own, memories of the Grey Havens, and a ship that had sailed into the uttermost east, bearing two figures in blue robes, their faces bright with purpose and their hearts full of hope for the great work that lay before them. That had been more than 2,000 years ago. What had become of that hope? What had they found in the lands beyond the Sea of Rhûn, where the maps of even the Dunedain showed only emptiness marked with the words, "Here be dragons," or "the waste"? And why did the very air seem to thicken with portent, as if the world itself held its breath in anticipation of some revelation that would change the fate of all who dwelt under the sky? As Shadowfax bore him through the eaves of Mirkwood, Gandalf saw that the blue-tinged leaves were falling now, carpeting the forest floor with a colour that belonged neither to summer nor winter, but to some season that had no name in the tongues of the West. Each leaf that touched the ground seemed to whisper a word in a language he almost recognized, almost, but not quite, like a song remembered from a dream that fades upon waking. Behind them, the ruins of Dol Guldur stood empty under the stars, but the wind that moved through its broken walls carried voices from the east, and those voices spoke of mysteries that were only now beginning to unfold. The Entwives had been lost for so long that even Treebeard spoke of them only in the deep hours of night, when the stars were bright and the memory of growing things ran strongest in the sap of the world. Yet in the autumn, when the blue leaves fell in Mirkwood, something stirred in the old forest that had not stirred for an age. Tom Bombadil felt it first as he walked the borders of his realm, where the Withywindle ran shallow over stones that remembered the music of creation. The willows bent their heads toward him as he passed, and in their rustling, he heard words in a tongue that was older than the elvish tongues, older perhaps than speech itself. It was the language of root and branch, of seasons turning and stars wheeling in their courses, and it spoke of strangers who had passed through the deep woods in days long forgotten. "Ho, Tom Bombadil," the old man Willow seemed to say, though his voice was like the sighing of wind through leaves. "Do you remember the blue ones who came singing down the Mythithel in the days when the world was greener? They carried staves of mountain ash and wore cloaks the colour of evening sky, and they sang such songs as made the very stones weep for joy." Tom paused in his walking and set his hand upon the ancient bark. In the touch of wood and flesh, memories flowed like water. Two tall figures in blue robes standing at the edge of the old forest, their faces young, though their eyes held the depth of stars. They had spoken with him in the dawn time of the Third Age, when the shadow of Dol Guldur was still but a whisper, and the White Council was not yet formed. "We go into the uttermost east," one had said, and his voice was like the sound of distant thunder over mountains. There are peoples there who have never heard the music of the Ainur, and shadows gather that are not of Sauron's making. If we do not return by the count of years, remember us not as we were, but as we shall become. And what shall you become? Tom had asked, though even then he feared the answer. The second blue wizard had smiled, and in that smile was both great sadness and inexorable resolve. What we must, he had replied. The Valar sent us to oppose the enemy, but they did not say we must remain unchanged in the opposing. In the east, we will learn new songs, and perhaps forget the old ones. We will become what the darkness requires us to become, that the light might endure. Now, more than 2,000 years later, Tom Bombadil felt the weight of that prophecy pressing upon his heart like a stone. The willows whispered of dreams that had come to them in the deep places of sleep, visions of great cities built in the shadow of mountains that scraped the sky, where men in strange garb performed rituals that would have made even the mouth of Sauron grow pale with horror. Yet in the midst of these dark dreams, the trees had glimpsed something that filled them with wonder. Two figures in blue robes, standing in a vast chamber lit by fires that burned without fuel, and around them knelt a company of men whose faces shone with a light that was not of this world. The blue wizards raised their hands, and the light grew brighter, and for a moment the shadows of that distant place were banished utterly. They have not fallen, whispered the ash trees that grew along the borders of Tom's domain. They have become something new, neither wholly of the west nor of the east, but bridges between the two, carrying fire into places where fire has never burned. But the whispers spoke also of a great peril approaching, for the powers of the east had taken notice of the light that burned in their realm. Ancient things that had slumbered since the fall of Morgoth were stirring, and armies were gathering that bore no banner known to the chronicles of Gondor. The blue wizards stood at the center of a storm that might well sweep across all the world, and whether they would prove strong enough to weather it, none could say. As Tom walked deeper into the old forest, following paths that only he remembered, the whispers grew stronger. The very air thrummed with portent, and he could feel the pulse of great events like a heartbeat in the earth beneath his feet. Somewhere in the east, a decision was being made that would echo through all the ages of the world, and the trees knew, as trees always know, that the time of choosing was at hand. In a grove where the oldest oaks grew, trees that had been saplings when Gil-galad ruled in Lindon, Tom found what he had been seeking, a single leaf of extraordinary size, blue as the depths of the sea and shot through with veins of silver that pulsed with their own light. It had not fallen from any tree in the old forest, nor indeed from any tree that grew in Middle-earth. As he lifted it in his hands, Tom felt a shock of recognition that ran through him like lightning. It was a leaf from Telperion the White, one of the two trees of Valinor, and it bore within it a message written in the secret script of the Valar. The words swam before his eyes like living things, reshaping themselves as he watched until their meaning became clear. The time of hiding is ended. The servants of the secret fire must stand forth, for the ancient darkness wakes and would devour all. Let Mithrandir the Grey know that his brothers in the east have need of counsel, and let the wise of Middle-earth prepare, for a test approaches that will try the hearts of all who love the light. signed in the name of the Blue Wizards, Morinetar, the Darkness Slayer, and Romistamu, the East Helper, who have not forgotten their charge nor forsaken their hope. Tom Bombadil folded the leaf carefully and placed it within his coat, where it lay against his heart like a coal from some divine fire. Around him, the old forest held its breath, waiting. In the east, powers beyond imagining were stirring to wakefulness, and the fate of all who dwelt under sky and star hung in the balance. The time of the last alliance was long past, but another alliance was forming, one that would span the breadth of the world and bind together hearts that had never before beaten in unison. And at its center stood two figures in blue robes, holding fast to a light that all the darkness of the world could not extinguish. 3 days after Tom Bombadil found the leaf of Telperion in the old forest, Gandalf the Grey came riding hard along the east-west road, his grey cloak streaming behind him like smoke before a gale. Shadowfax bore him with the speed of the wind itself, for the urgency that drove the wizard brooked no delay. In his inner pocket, wrapped in cloth of Lothlorien, lay a small phial of water from Galadriel's mirror, water that still held within it the reflection of visions too terrible and wonderful to be borne by mortal sight. The countryside fled past them in a blur of brown fields and golden woodlands, but Gandalf's mind was turned inward, wrestling with the implications of what the Lady of Light had shown him. In the mirror's depths, he had seen the blue wizards as they were now, changed, weathered, bearing scars both visible and hidden, yet still themselves at the core. They stood in a great circular chamber carved from living rock, its walls inscribed with runes that predated the founding of Númenor, and around them moved figures in robes of many colors, not wizards, for the Astari were only 5, but men who had learned to bear light as others bear swords. Most troubling of all had been the vision of what lay beneath that chamber, a vast network of tunnels and caverns stretching eastward beyond the edges of the world as men knew it. And in those depths, things stirring that had no names in any tongue of the free peoples. They were not orcs nor trolls, nor any creature that served the Dark Lord of Mordor. They were older, stranger, carrying within them echoes of the music of creation gone discord, and they moved with purpose towards some goal that filled even Gandalf's ancient heart with dread. As Shadowfax crested a hill overlooking the valley of the Bruinen, Gandalf drew rein for the first time since leaving Lothlorien. Below them lay Rivendell, the last homely house, its lights twinkling like fallen stars in the gathering dusk. Smoke rose from its chimneys, and the sound of elvish voices singing drifted up on the evening air, voices that spoke of peace, of rest, of sanctuary from the cares of the world. Yet even here, in this haven east of the sea, Gandalf could feel the tremor of distant events pressing against the borders of tranquility like floodwaters against a dam. He urged Shadowfax down the winding path toward the house of Elrond, past gardens where the last roses of the year bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. The very air seemed to shimmer with elvish magic, and for a moment, Gandalf felt the weight of his burden lighten. Here, if anywhere, wisdom might be found to guide them through the trials ahead. Elrond met him at the door of the great hall, and in the Elf Lord's ageless eyes, Gandalf saw that he already knew something of what had brought the Grey Wizard riding in such haste. "Mithrandir," Elrond said, and his voice carried the weight of ages and the sorrow of all partings. I have felt the trembling in the earth, and my heart tells me that the time of hiding is ending. Come, there are others here who have long awaited word from the uttermost east. Within the hall, a fire burned bright upon the hearth, and before it sat two figures that made Gandalf's heart leap with surprise and something akin to relief. Círdan the shipwright had come from the grey havens, his hair silver as sea foam, and his eyes deep as the waters that bore the ships of the Eldar into the west. Beside him sat Glorfindel, golden-haired and mighty, who had faced the Balrog at the fall of Gondolin and returned from the halls of Mandos to walk again under the stars of Middle-earth. The keepers of the three, Gandalf murmured. An understanding began to dawn in his mind, like the first light of morning. You have felt it too, the stirring in the east, the awakening of powers that have long slept. Círdan nodded gravely. Ships have come to the Grey Havens, bearing tidings from the Bay of Forochel and beyond, tales of lights seen dancing on the horizon where no lights should be, and voices heard singing in the depths of the sea in tongues that predate the drowning of Beleriand. The very waves speak of change, Mithrandir, and the gulls cry warnings that make my heart heavy with foreboding. Glorfindel leaned forward, his face grave in the firelight. And I have ridden the borders of our realm, from the misty mountains to the weather hills, and everywhere I find signs of stirring. The horses speak of dreams that come to them in the darkness, dreams of great caverns filled with light that is not of sun or moon or star. And in that light they see riders mounted on steeds that shine like silver, bearing banners marked with devices unknown to the heraldry of the West. Elrond gestured for Gandalf to take his place before the fire, and as the Grey Wizard settled himself upon the ancient chair that had been his whenever he sought counsel in Rivendell, he felt the full weight of the years pressing upon him. How long had it been since the 5 Istari had walked together under the sky? How long since he had heard the voices of his blue-robed brothers raised in song or counsel? "There is more," Gandalf said, and drew forth the phial from Lothlorien. As he uncorked it, the water within began to glow with a soft light, and in that light images formed and shifted like memories made visible. Galadriel has seen much in her mirror, and what she has shown me fills me with both hope and terror in equal measure. The water rose from the phial without being poured, hanging in the air between them like a sphere of liquid starlight. Within its depths, visions played out in miniature. The blue wizards standing in their chamber of stone, their faces marked by sacrifice and sorrow, yet still bright with purpose. The dark things stirring in the depths below, ancient beyond measure and hungry for the light. And strangest of all, a great eagle flying eastward over lands unknown, bearing in its talons a staff of blue wood that pulsed with inner fire. "Quiet here," breathed Glorfindel, recognizing the great eagle even in vision. "But what errand takes the Lord of the Eagles into the uttermost east?" Gandalf's voice was heavy with portent as he replied, "The same errand that may soon take us all, my friends. The blue wizards have sent word, not by ship or rider, but by ways known only to the wise. They have need of us, and if we do not answer their call, then all our victories in the west may prove as dust before the storm that is gathering in the east." The fire crackled on the hearth, and outside the windows of Rivendell, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the east, beyond the sea of Rhûn, and the mountains that marked the edge of their maps, two figures in blue robes stood watch against a darkness older than Sauron, and their light was all that stood between Middle-earth and a calamity that would make the War of the Ring seem but a skirmish by comparison. Dawn came grey and cold to Rivendell, and with it a decision that would echo through all the ages of the world. As the Council of the Wise broke their fast in the Hall of Fire, Gandalf spoke the words that each had known must come, yet none had wished to hear. "I must return to Dol Guldur," he said, setting down his cup with hands that trembled not from age, but from the weight of necessity. "The fortress is cleansed, yes, and its stones sing no more with malice, but it stands at the crossroads of all the paths that lead eastward. If there are signs to be read of what stirs beyond the Sea of Ruin, they will be written in the very air above those ruins." Elrond's face was grave as mountain stone. "The shadow that dwelt there is gone, Mithrandir, but shadows leave marks upon the places they have touched. What you seek to learn may exact a price higher than wisdom warrants." Yet even as he spoke, the Lord of Rivendell knew that the choice was already made. In the light of morning, Gandalf's eyes held a gleam that spoke of roads that must be walked, regardless of where they led. Círdan nodded slowly, understanding passing between the bearers of the secret fire like light between mirrors. "If you go, you do not go alone," the shipwright said. "Glorfindel shall ride with you, for his light has faced the darkness before and emerged undiminished. And I shall return to the havens and prepare such ships as may be needed, should your journey in the east require swifter passage than the roads can provide." Thus it was that two riders set forth from Rivendell as the sun climbed toward its zenith, one grey-cloaked upon a horse white as sea foam, the other golden bright upon a steed that seemed wrought of starlight and wind. Behind them, the last homely house grew small in the distance, its peace undisturbed by the weight of the errand that carried them forth. They rode through the day without speaking, each lost in thoughts too deep for words. The road they followed had been old when Gil-galad was young, worn smooth by the Saab passage of countless feet in the days when the Elder still travelled freely between their hidden realms. Now it bore only the two of them, and their horses' hoofbeats echoed strangely in the crisp autumn air, as if the very earth held its breath in anticipation. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, they came at last to the eaves of Mirkwood, and there Gandalf drew rein. Before them stretched the forest that had once been Greenwood the Great, its trees still showing the scars of the long years when shadow had dwelt at its heart. But now, in the slanting light of evening, something had changed. The trees at the forest's edge leaned eastward, as if straining to hear some distant sound, and their leaves rustled without wind, whispering in voices too low for even elvish ears to catch. Most strange of all, the very air above the forest seemed to shimmer, as if heated by some invisible fire, and in that shimmer, shapes moved that might have been birds or shadows, or something else entirely. "Do you see it?" Gandalf asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Glorfindel's eyes, which had looked upon the light of Valinor and returned from the halls of waiting, gazed into the shimmer above the trees and saw what mortal sight could not perceive. "Messengers," he said, and wonder crept into his voice despite the gravity of their errand. "Eagles, but not of any breed that flies in the skies we know. They bear words written in flame upon their wings, and those words speak of summons and of need that grows with each passing hour. As they watched, one of the shadow eagles broke away from its fellows and swooped low over their heads. For a moment, Gandalf felt the brush of great wings against his mind, and in that touch he heard a voice that he had not heard for more than 2,000 years, the voice of Alatar, the first of the blue wizards, speaking across the vast leagues that separated them. "Brother," the voice whispered like wind through mountain passes, "the darkness wakes in the uttermost depths, and we are too few to stand against it. The peoples of the East cry out for deliverance, and we have become their shield and their light. But the enemy that comes is not Sauron. It is older, hungrier, and it knows our names. Come, if you would see the world endure. Come, before the last flame is quenched in the dark." The vision faded, and the shadow eagle was gone, leaving only the shimmer above the trees and the whisper of leaves that spoke of journeys yet to come. Gandalf sat motionless upon Shadowfax, his face pale as winter moonlight, while Glorfindel watched him with eyes full of concern. "What did you hear?" the Elf Lord asked. Gandalf was silent for a long moment, gazing toward the east where the first stars were beginning to appear. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of all the sorrows of the world. "I heard the sound of hope stretched to its breaking point, and the cry of light besieged by darkness beyond imagining. They have called, Glorfindel, and we must answer. But first, we must see what signs Dol Guldur may yet reveal." They rode into Mirkwood as night fell, and the trees closed about them, like old friends welcoming wanderers home. But in the distance, beyond leagues of forest and hill, the ruins of Dol Guldur stood silhouetted against the stars, and from its broken towers came a light that was neither flame nor star, a blue radiance that pulsed like a heartbeat, calling across the darkness with a voice that spoke of mysteries soon to be revealed. Above them, the shadow eagles wheeled and cried, their voices carrying messages between the worlds, and in their flight patterns, Gandalf read the signs of a great convergence approaching, a moment when all the paths of fate would meet, and the destiny of Middle-earth would hang upon the choices of those who bore light in the darkness. The time of the blue wizards was ending, and the time of revelation was at hand. The ruins of Dol Guldur rose before them, like the bones of some great beast left to bleach under the stars. Where once the hill of sorcery had brooded in malice, crowned with towers that leaked shadow like poison, now stood only broken stone and empty archways that framed nothing but night sky. Yet as Gandalf and Glorfindel approached the outer walls, both felt the weight of memory pressing upon them. Not their own memories, but the memories held within the very stones, echoes of all that had transpired in this place across the long years of its darkness. The blue light they had seen from afar grew stronger as they climbed the winding path that led to the fortress gates. It emanated not from any torch or brazier, but from the stones themselves, as if the rock had absorbed some essence of starlight and now gave it back transformed. Where the light touched, strange symbols became visible, runes carved deep into the walls that had not been there during Sauron's tenure, signs that spoke in the ancient tongue of Valinor and told of binding and loosing, of doors opened between the circles of the world. "These markings," Glorfindel whispered, running his fingers along the carved symbols with wonder and growing unease. "They are not of Middle-earth's making. I have seen their like only once before, graven upon the pillars of Tirion in the days before the darkening of Valinor. Gandalf's face was grim as he studied the runes. The work of the Astari, he said, but not any working that was taught to us in the Undying Lands. This is knowledge learned in exile, wisdom born of necessity and desperation. My brothers have been busy in their long absence. They passed through the broken gates and into the courtyard where grass had begun to grow between the paving stones. Here the blue radiance was strongest, flowing up from the earth itself like water seeking the surface. In its light, the ruins seemed almost alive, walls breathing with the slow rhythm of sleeping giants, shadows that moved independent of any object that might cast them. At the center of the courtyard stood what had once been the base of Sauron's great tower. The necromancer's stronghold had been cast down when the White Council drove him forth, its stones scattered like the bones of the dead. But now, in that empty space, something new had grown, not built, but grown, like a tree of living crystal that pulsed with the same blue fire that illuminated the walls. It was beautiful and terrible, this thing that had no name in any tongue of Middle-earth. Its trunk was clear as mountain ice, shot through with veins of sapphire and silver that carried light from its roots deep in the earth to its crown that reached toward the stars. Around its base, the scattered stones of Sauron's tower had arranged themselves in patterns that hurt to look upon directly, geometries that seemed to fold in upon themselves, creating spaces that were larger within than without. A door, Gandalf breathed, understanding flooding through him like cold water. They have made a door, not between lands, but between the layers of the world itself. Through this, messages pass swifter than any eagle's flight, and perhaps more than messages. As if summoned by his words, the crystal tree began to sing, a sound like wind through crystal caves, like starlight made audible, like the memory of the music of the Ainur echoing down through all the ages of the world. The song had no words, yet its meaning was clear to those who had ears to hear. Come, step through. The need is great, and time grows short. Glorfindel drew his sword, not in threat, but in readiness, for the blade Orcrist had been forged in Gondolin, and bore within it light that could cleave shadows as easily as flesh. In the crystal tree's radiance, the sword's blade shone like captured starfire, and its light revealed things hidden in the ruins around them. They were not alone. Shapes moved in the shadows beyond the courtyard, tall figures draped in robes that seemed woven from twilight itself. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but their eyes gleamed with the same blue fire that flowed through the crystal tree. They moved with purpose, arranging objects around the base of the strange growth, staffs of wood that Gandalf did not recognize, crystals that sang in harmony with the tree's song, scrolls covered with writing that seemed to shift and change even as he watched. The servants of the Blue Wizards, Glorfindel said, his voice tight with wonder and wariness. But they are not men as we know them, nor elves, nor any of the children of Ilúvatar. Gandalf stepped closer to the crystal tree, feeling its pull like gravity, like the call of the sea to one who has lived long upon dry land. They are what men become, he said softly, when they learn to bear light as we bear it. The Blue Wizards have not merely taught the peoples of the East, they have transformed them, made them into something new. Whether this is blessing or curse, I cannot say. One of the hooded figures approached them, moving with grace that seemed to bend the very air around it. When it spoke, its voice was like the echo of distant thunder, resonant with power, yet touched with infinite sadness. Mithrandir the Grey, it said, and in the speaking of his name, Gandalf heard notes of welcome and warning intermingled. Long have we waited for your coming. The Masters call from the uttermost east, where the ancient darkness stirs and the foundations of the world tremble. Will you answer? Will you step through the door between the spheres and see what your brothers have wrought in the lands beyond the sunrise? The crystal tree's song grew louder, more insistent, and within its crystalline trunk shapes began to form. Images of vast cities built in the shadow of mountains that scraped the sky, of armies marching beneath banners that bore devices unknown to the heraldry of the West, of two figures in blue robes standing upon a precipice above an abyss that seemed to reach down to the very roots of creation. Gandalf reached out his hand toward the tree's surface, feeling the warmth of its light upon his palm like summer sunlight. One touch, and the door would open. One step, and he would stand beside his long-lost brothers in the uttermost east, sharing their burden and their peril. But before his fingers could brush the crystal bark, the tree's song changed, taking on notes of urgency and alarm. The images within its trunk shifted, showing new visions. Darkness rising from the depths, ancient things that had no name stirring to wakefulness, and over all, the sense of time running out like sand through an hourglass. Not yet, Gandalf whispered, drawing back his hand with an effort that left him trembling. There are preparations to be made, alliances to be forged. If I am to aid them, I must bring more than just myself to their need. The hooded figure bowed its head in understanding. The Masters knew you would say thus, it said. Time grows short, but wisdom counsels patience still. Yet know this, Grey Pilgrim, each day you delay, the darkness grows stronger. Soon even the door between the worlds may not suffice to carry aid where aid is needed most sorely. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with fingers of gold and rose, the crystal tree's song faded to a whisper, and the hooded figures melted away into the shadows like morning mist. Only Gandalf and Glorfindel remained in the courtyard of Dol Guldur, standing before the impossible tree that had grown where evil once held dominion, their hearts heavy with the weight of revelations that would change the fate of all the world. It was as the first rays of sunlight touched the crystal tree that Gandalf heard the voice, not the song of the crystalline growth, nor the whispered words of the hooded servants, but something else entirely. A voice that spoke from the depths of the earth itself, from chambers far below the ruins where no light had ever penetrated, save perhaps the blue radiance that now flowed through the stones, like lifeblood through veins. Mithrandir, the voice called, and in it, Gandalf heard the echo of majesty long fallen, of pride brought low by ages of suffering, yet still unbroken. Come down to me, Grey Pilgrim. Come down and hear the words that I have held in trust for 2,000 years, waiting for one with wisdom enough to understand their meaning. Glorfindel's hand went to his sword hilt, for the voice carried with it a power that made the very air tremble, and yet there was no malice in it, only an infinite weariness and a longing that spoke of hope, deferred but not destroyed. Who calls? Gandalf asked, though in his heart he began to suspect the answer, and the suspicion filled him with wonder and dread in equal measure. One who ruled in splendor when the world was young, came the reply. one who fell into shadow and dwelt long in the halls of the enemy, yet never yielded the last fortress of his will. I am Gil-galad, who was High King of the Eldar, and I am not dead, neither am I truly alive. I am held between, keeper of secrets that must not die with me, guardian of truths that the blue wizards need you to know. The crystal tree pulsed brighter, and in its light, a doorway appeared in the earth at its base, not carved or built, but simply present, as if it had always been there and only now chose to reveal itself. Stone steps led downward into depths that seemed to swallow light itself, yet from below came the blue radiance, calling like a beacon in the dark. Gandalf looked to Glorfindel, and in the Elf Lord's eyes, he saw the same mixture of awe and fear that filled his own heart. Gil-galad had died at the siege of Barad-dûr, his life spent in the final stroke that brought down Sauron at the end of the Second Age. Yet here was his voice, speaking from depths unknown, and in that voice was the ring of truth that could not be gainsaid. "If this is some trap of the enemy," Glorfindel began, but Gandalf raised his hand for silence. "No trap," the wizard said softly. "I feel no malice here, no deception, only sorrow and a burden carried too long in solitude. We must go down, my friend. There are truths waiting in the darkness that we cannot afford to leave unheard." They descended the stone steps, their feet echoing in the narrow passage that wound ever deeper into the earth. The walls were smooth as glass, carved with runes that seemed to shift and change in the blue light that emanated from the depths. Some were in the script of the Eldar, others in tongues that predated the awakening of the firstborn, and all of them spoke of binding and holding, of secrets kept safe against the ravages of time. At last, they emerged into a vast chamber hewn from living rock, its ceiling lost in shadows that no light could penetrate. In the center of the chamber stood a throne carved from a single block of white stone, and upon that throne sat a figure that made both wizard and elf lord catch their breath in amazement. It was Gil-galad, yet not as he had been in life. His form was translucent, shot through with the same blue radiance that flowed through the crystal tree above, and his eyes held depths that spoke of ages spent in contemplation of mysteries beyond mortal understanding. The crown of the High Kings rested still upon his brow, but it too was transformed, wrought now of light rather than gold, pulsing with each beat of some cosmic heart. "Welcome, Mithrandir," Gil-galad said, and his voice echoed in the chamber like the memory of trumpets that once sounded in the halls of Lindon. "Welcome, Glorfindel of Gondolin, who returned from the halls of waiting to walk again under the stars. Long have I waited for this hour, when at last I could speak the words that were given to me in trust." Gandalf stepped forward, his own staff glowing softly in response to the presence of the spectral king. "How is this possible, Gil-galad? You died at the siege of Barad-dûr. I saw your body laid to rest in the halls of Lindon." The High King's smile was sad as winter moonlight. "I died, yes, but death was not the end for me. In the moment when Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand, in that instant when the Dark Lord's power was broken and scattered, I felt a summons that came not from the halls of Mandos, but from the uttermost east. The blue wizards called to me across the void between life and death, and I answered, for they had need of a guardian who could not be corrupted by shadow, could not be turned aside by threat or promise. He gestured with one translucent hand toward the walls of the chamber, and in response they began to glow with inner light. Images formed in the stone, visions of the blue wizards in the early days of their mission, when they still wore their physical forms and walked openly among the peoples of the East. Gandalf saw them teaching and healing, bringing light to places where darkness had reigned unchallenged since the fall of Morgoth. They came to the lands beyond the Sea of Rhûn as you remember them, Gil-galad continued, but they found more than they expected. The servants of the Dark Valar had not been idle in the long years since his defeat. They had delved deep, awakening things that should have remained sleeping until the end of all things. The blue wizards fought these powers for an age, and in fighting them, they were changed. The images shifted, showing the two blue wizards standing before a great abyss from which emanated a darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour light itself. As Gandalf watched, he saw them cast aside their staffs and their robes, shedding their physical forms as a snake sheds its skin, becoming beings of pure light and will. They sacrificed their bodies to become guardians of the deep places, Gil-galad said, his voice heavy with sorrow and pride. They became the light that holds back the darkness, the barrier that prevents the ancient evils from rising to ravage the world above. But such vigilance exacts a price, and they grow weary. The darkness presses against their defenses, and they fear that soon they will not have strength enough to hold it back. Glorfindel stepped forward, his face pale with understanding. They need reinforcement. They call for aid not because they have failed, but because they dare not fail. Just so, Gil-galad nodded. And I have been their messenger, their voice in the depths, carrying word between the west and the uttermost east through the secret ways that run beneath the world. But now, the time of secrecy is ending. The darkness grows too strong for subtle measures. They must have help openly given, or all their sacrifice will be in vain. The spectral king rose from his throne, and as he did, the blue radiance in the chamber grew brighter, revealing alcoves carved into the walls where treasures beyond price lay waiting. There were scrolls written in the hands of the blue wizards themselves, maps of the deep places where the ancient darkness dwelt, and weapons forged in the fires of creation that could cleave shadows as easily as flesh. Take these, Gil-galad said, gesturing toward the alcoves. Take them to the wise in the west, and tell them that the time of the last battle draws near, not the battle against Sauron that is yet to come in the years ahead, but the greater battle that has been raging in secret since the world was young. The blue wizards cannot hold their vigil much longer alone. They need the strength of all who serve the light, or the darkness will rise and devour the world entire. As Gandalf reached out to take the scrolls from their resting place, Gil-galad's form began to fade, becoming ever more translucent until he was little more than a whisper of light upon the throne. "Remember me to Elrond," the High King said, his voice growing distant as a dream upon waking. "Tell him that Gil-galad keeps faith still, though the path he walks lies far from the sunlit lands. And tell him that the blue wizards send their love to all who remain in the west, and their hope that when the final darkness falls, it will find them standing together as they stood at the last alliance, with light in their hearts and courage undimmed." The vision faded, and Gil-galad was gone, leaving only the echo of his words and the treasure trove of secrets that would change the fate of all the world. As Gandalf and Glorfindel emerged from the depths beneath Dol Guldur, their arms laden with the precious scrolls and artifacts that Gil-galad had entrusted to them, the morning sun hung low in the eastern sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard where the crystal tree still sang its otherworldly song. Yet something had changed in their absence. A darkness had crept into the blue radiance, like ink dropped into clear water, and the tree's music now carried undertones that spoke of malice and ancient hunger. The hooded servants were gone, fled, or hidden, and in their place stood a figure that made both wizard and elf lord freeze with recognition and dread. It was tall and clad in robes that seemed woven from shadow itself, and though its face was hidden beneath a deep hood, its presence filled the air with the stench of decay and the whisper of old evils stirring. Mithrandir the Grey, the figure spoke, and his voice was like the sound of iron dragged across stone, like the last breath of dying men, like the memory of screams echoing in empty halls. How fitting that we should meet again in this place where I once held dominion. How poetic that you should come here seeking knowledge of your blue-robed brothers when it is I who know their fate better than any. Gandalf stepped forward, his staff blazing with white light that pushed back the creeping shadows. "You are banished from this place, Sauron," he said, his voice ringing with authority that had been granted to him in the undying lands. "The necromancer of Dol Guldur is no more. You have no power here." The Dark Lord's laughter was like the sound of tombstones cracking in winter frost. "Power? You speak of power as if it were a thing that could be contained by walls of stone or bound by the pronouncements of the White Council. I am diminished, yes, cast down and scattered like leaves before the wind. But I am not destroyed, Grey Fool, and there are ways of influence that do not require the fullness of my strength." As he spoke, the crystal tree's song grew discordant, its blue light flickering like a candle in a storm. The scrolls and artifacts in Gandalf's arms grew heavy, as if they had absorbed some portion of the malice that filled the air. "You carry secrets from the depths," Sauron continued, circling them like a wolf around a campfire. "Treasures given by the Phantom King, who thinks himself still mighty, still relevant to the affairs of the living world. But what has he told you of your precious blue wizards? What truths has he shared about their glorious sacrifice?" Glorfindel drew his sword, its blade singing as it came free of its sheath. But the Dark Lord merely laughed again. "Peace, Golden One. I come not to fight, but to enlighten. Would you not know the fate of Alatar and Pallando? Would you not hear the truth of what they have become in the uttermost east?" Despite every instinct that screamed against it, Gandalf found himself listening. There was something in Sauron's voice, not truth, for the enemy was the father of lies, but a kernel of knowledge wrapped in deception, like a poisoned seed hidden in wholesome fruit. "Speak then," the Grey Wizard said, his staff held ready to strike. "But know that every word you utter will be weighed against the wisdom of the wise, and if you seek to turn us from our purpose with false counsel, you will find us proof against your wiles." Sauron's hood turned toward the crystal tree, and in its flickering light, shadows moved beneath the dark fabric that might have been the remnants of a face. "Your brothers went into the east as healers and teachers," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone of full sympathy. "They found peoples oppressed by darkness and offered them hope. How noble, how pure. But tell me, Mithrandir, What happens when hope is not enough? What happens when the darkness is too strong for healing, too deep for teaching to reach? The images began to form in the air above them, conjured by the Dark Lord's will and the malice that still clung to this place despite its cleansing. Gandalf saw the blue wizards as they had been in the early days of their mission, young in appearance despite their ancient wisdom, their faces bright with purpose and compassion. They tried to work as you would have worked, Sauron continued, and now his voice carried a note of genuine sorrow that was somehow more terrible than his mockery. Gentle persuasion, slow teaching, patient healing of wounds that had festered for centuries. And they failed, Mithrandir. They failed because the darkness they faced was not mere ignorance or corruption, but something far older and more cunning. The images shifted, showing the blue wizards standing before vast armies of men who knelt not in worship but in terror, their faces blank with a despair so complete that it had consumed their very souls. Beyond them loomed mountains that bled shadow into the sky, and from those shadows came voices that spoke in the black speech, but in dialects that predated even Sauron's dominion. The ancient servants of Morgoth were not all destroyed in the ruin of Angband, the Dark Lord whispered. Some fled eastward into the deep places of the world, and there they multiplied and grew strong. They built empires of shadow in the lands beyond your maps, and when your blue wizards came with their message of hope and healing, they were already too late. The peoples of the East were not merely oppressed, they were transformed, made into something that could no longer hear the music of creation. Gandalf's face was pale as winter moonlight, but his voice remained steady. Even if this were true, and I do not grant that it is, what would you have us do? Abandon them to their fate? Turn our backs on those who need our aid? Oh, but that is not what your brothers chose, Sauron said, and now his voice carried a note of terrible admiration. No, they were too noble for that, too proud to admit defeat. Instead, they chose a different path, one that I myself might have chosen in their place. The images above them changed again, showing the blue wizards in a great chamber carved from living rock, their faces gaunt with privation and marked by sacrifices that had aged them beyond their years. Around them knelt figures in robes of many colors, not the hooded servants they had seen before, but men whose faces shone with an inner light that was beautiful and terrible to behold. They made themselves into gods, Sauron whispered, his voice thick with a satisfaction that made Gandalf's blood run cold. When gentle teaching failed, they turned to harsher methods. When healing could not reach the corruption, they burned it out with fire. When hope proved insufficient, they offered certainty, the certainty of absolute submission to their will. The Dark Lord gestured toward the crystal tree, whose light now pulsed in rhythm with his words. This pretty bauble is not a door between worlds, grey fool. It is a chain, a link in a vast network of control that stretches across all the lands of the East. Through it, your brothers speak directly into the minds of their followers, commanding their thoughts, directing their actions, making them extensions of their own will. Glorfindel's sword blazed brighter, as if in response to the growing horror of the revelation. "You lie," he said, his voice tight with anger and denial. "The Istari were sent to guide, not to rule. They would never." "Would they not?" Sauron interrupted, turning his hooded gaze upon the Elf Lord. "And what would you do, Golden One, if you stood in a land where every soul had been twisted by darkness, where every word of hope fell upon ears that could no longer hear, where every act of healing was undone by corruption that ran deeper than bone, would you not be tempted to use whatever power you possessed to force salvation upon those too lost to choose it for themselves? The images faded, leaving only the flickering blue light of the crystal tree and the stench of malice that seemed to cling to every stone of Dol Guldur. Sauron's form began to waver, becoming translucent as Gil-galad's had been. But where the High King's spirit had radiated sorrow and hope, the Dark Lord's presence spoke only of bitter triumph. "Go then," he said, his voice growing distant as his form dispersed like smoke. "Carry your scrolls and your artifacts to the wise in the west. Tell them of the Blue Wizard's great sacrifice, their noble transformation into beings of pure light. But remember this, Mithrandir, the road to Mordor is paved with good intentions, and your brothers have built an empire in the east that makes my dominion seem like a child's game of kings and kingdoms." The shadow was gone, leaving only the crystal tree singing its discordant song and the weight of terrible possibility pressing upon their hearts. Gandalf stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the artifacts in his arms, wondering if they carried salvation or damnation to the lands of the West. "Is it true?" Glorfindel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gandalf's answer was heavy with all the sorrows of the world. "I do not know," he said, "and that, my friend, may be the most frightening truth of all." The silence that followed Sauron's departure hung over Dol Guldur, like a shroud woven from doubt and dread. Gandalf stood motionless before the crystal tree, the scrolls and artifacts clutched against his chest, as if they were both treasure and curse. The blue radiance that had seemed so pure, so hopeful when they first beheld it, now pulsed with an ambiguity that made his ancient heart ache with uncertainty. "No," he said at last, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade through silk. "No, I will not let the deceiver's words poison the well of hope. Whatever my brothers have become, whatever choices they have made in the uttermost east, I will judge them by their deeds, not by the whispers of the enemy." Glorfindel turned to him, and in the Elf Lord's eyes was a hope as fragile as morning frost. "Then what would you have us do? The scrolls we carry speak of urgent need, but if Sauron spoke truly—" "If," Gandalf interrupted, raising his staff so that his light drove back the creeping shadows that seemed to thicken around them. "That word is the foundation of all wisdom and the root of all despair. We know nothing for certain save this. Our brothers call to us across the vast leagues of the world, and Gil-galad himself bore witness to their need. That is truth enough to act upon." He stepped closer to the crystal tree, studying its faceted surface with eyes that had looked upon the light of Valinor and remembered still its purity. Within the crystalline depths, images swirled like leaves in an autumn wind, glimpses of the eastern lands, fragments of faces both terrible and beautiful, echoes of voices raised in songs that might have been hymns of praise or cries of anguish. "Show me," Gandalf whispered to the tree, laying his free hand upon its smooth surface. "Show me not what the enemy would have me see, but what is. Show me my brothers as they truly are, beyond the veil of fear and doubt." The crystal grew warm beneath his palm, and the blue radiance intensified until it blazed like a star brought down to earth. The images within the tree's heart sharpened, became clearer, and Gandalf saw. He saw Alatar standing upon a mountaintop that scraped the belly of the sky, his blue robes whipping in winds that carried the scent of distant seas. But he was not alone. Around him stood a company of men whose faces bore the marks of great suffering transformed into strength. They were not the blank-eyed thralls that Sauron had shown them, but warriors who had chosen their path with eyes wide open, knowing the cost and counting it well paid. The vision shifted, showing Pallando in a great library whose shelves stretched beyond sight, filled with books written in scripts that hurt to look upon. Yet he was not hoarding knowledge, but sharing it, teaching scribes and scholars who labored to translate the ancient darkness into words that could be understood and thus defeated. His face was aged beyond his years, marked by sorrows that would have broken lesser spirits, but his eyes still held the light of hope, undimmed. "They are not gods," Gandalf breathed, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over mountains. "They are guardians still, but guardians who have learned that sometimes the light must burn with fiercer flame to drive back the deeper darkness." The crystal tree's song changed, becoming sweeter, more harmonious, as if responding to the truth that Gandalf had recognized. New images formed within its depths, images of cities where men lived in peace, beneath banners that bore the sign of the secret fire, of children playing in gardens where flowers grew that had not bloomed since the elder days, of warriors who stood watch, not over cowering subjects, but over people they loved and had sworn to protect. Yet even as hope kindled in his heart, Gandalf saw also the shadows that pressed against those havens of light. From deep places in the earth came things that had no names in any tongue of the free peoples, creatures that were darkness given form, malice made manifest, hunger that could never be sated. Against these horrors, the blue wizards and their followers stood as a thin line of fire in the darkness, holding back a tide that would otherwise have swept across all the world. "The burden is too great for two to bear alone," Glorfindel said, reading the visions with eyes that had witnessed the fall of Gondolin and understood the weight of impossible odds. "They need aid, and soon, or their light will be quenched and the darkness will pour forth like a flood." Gandalf nodded, his face grim with resolve. "Then we must gather that aid. The White Council must be summoned, the wise of Middle-earth brought together in common cause. And more than that," he gestured towards the artifacts they carried. "These must be studied, their secrets unlocked. If we are to aid our brothers, we must understand the nature of the enemy they face." He stepped back from the crystal tree, and as he did, its light began to fade, becoming once more the gentle blue radiance they had first observed. The visions within its depths grew dim, but not before Gandalf glimpsed one final image, a great eagle soaring eastward over lands unmarked by any map, bearing in its talons a message written in letters of flame. "Gwaihir flies to summon them," he said, understanding the significance of what he had seen. "The eagles will carry word to my brothers that help is coming, but we must not delay. Every moment we tarry, the darkness grows stronger." As they prepared to leave Dol Guldur, gathering the precious scrolls and artifacts that would change the fate of all the world, Gandalf paused one last time before the crystal tree. In its depths, he thought he saw the faces of his long-lost brothers looking back at him across the vast leagues that separated them, and in their eyes was gratitude mixed with warning. The time of secrets was ending. The war in the darkness was about to become a war in the light, and whether Middle-earth would survive, the revelation remained to be seen. "Come," Gandalf said to Glorfindel, shouldering his pack with the care of one who bore the hopes of the world. "We ride for Rivendell, and from there to whatever counsel the wise deem necessary. The Blue Wizards have held their vigil for 2,000 years. Now it is time for the rest of us to take up our share of the burden." Behind them, as they passed through the broken gates of Dol Guldur, the crystal tree continued its song, a melody that spoke of courage in the face of overwhelming darkness, of hope maintained against all reason, and of brotherhood that could span the breadth of the world and endure beyond the ending of all things. The fire in the darkness burned on and would burn until the last star fell from the sky, or the victory was won at last. The great hall of Rivendell had not seen such a gathering since the days when Gil-galad walked among the living, and the last alliance was more than memory carved in stone. Around the circular table that Elrond had caused to be set in the center of the chamber sat the mightiest of the wise who remained in Middle-earth, their faces grave in the light of torches that burned with flames of silver and gold. Gandalf the Grey sat at Elrond's right hand, the scrolls and artifacts from Gil-galad's hidden chamber spread before him like the fragments of some vast puzzle that would reshape their understanding of the world. Beside him, Glorfindel bore witness to all they had seen and heard in the depths of Dol Guldur, his golden hair seeming dim in the light of revelations that outshone even the glory of the Eldar. Across from them sat Círdan the shipwright, who had come from the Grey Havens with tidings that made the blood run cold in elvish veins. Ships had foundered in the Bay of Foroshel, their crews speaking of lights beneath the waves and voices calling in tongues that predated the awakening of the firstborn. The very sea, it seemed, was stirring with portents of change. Galadriel sat at the table's head, her mirror wrapped in cloth of silver and laid before her like a weapon that might yet be needed. In her eyes was reflected the weight of all the ages she had witnessed, and in her voice was the authority of one who had looked upon the light of the two trees and remembered still their music. "Speak then, Mithrandir," she said, and her words rang in the hall like bells of crystal struck in unison. "Tell us what you have learned in the depths, and let the wise judge what counsel should be given." Gandalf rose, his staff glowing softly in his hand, and began to speak. He told them of the crystal tree that grew where Sauron's tower once stood, of the hooded servants who were neither wholly of the west nor of the east, of Gil-galad's spectral presence, keeping watch over secrets that had waited 2,000 years to be revealed. As he spoke, the scrolls upon the table began to glow with their own inner light, their ancient script becoming visible to eyes that had the wisdom to read them. Maps unfolded that showed lands beyond the Sea of Rune, marked with cities whose names were written in characters that hurt the mind to contemplate. There were diagrams of the deep places where the Shai-Samad, old darkness, dwelt, and formulae for binding powers that should never have been loosed upon the world. But it was when Gandalf spoke of Sauron's visitation that the assembled wise grew truly alarmed. The Dark Lord's words hung in the air like poison, seeping into every corner of the hall until even the flames of the torches seemed to flicker with uncertainty. He seeks to turn us against our brothers with whispers and half-truths," Gandalf concluded, his voice heavy with the weight of possibility. "Yet I cannot dismiss entirely the fear that some kernel of truth lies hidden in his lies. What if the blue wizards have indeed become something we no longer recognize? What if their methods in the East have corrupted them as surely as power corrupted the enemy himself?" Elrond leaned forward, his ageless face marked by lines of care that had deepened with each passing age. "You speak of corruption, Mithrandir, but what is corruption save the twisting of good intentions by the touch of despair? If our brothers have changed in the uttermost East, might it not be that they have adapted to face an evil we in the West cannot even imagine?" Círdan nodded slowly, his eyes distant with the memory of ships that had sailed into the sunrise and never returned. "The sea speaks to me of transformations," he said, his voice like the whisper of waves upon distant shores. "Not all change is decay. Not all adaptation is corruption. The blue wizards went into lands where the very air was thick with malice. Perhaps they became what they needed to become, to survive and serve. It was Galadriel who spoke the words that all had been thinking, but none had dared to voice. "There is only one way to know the truth," she said, unwrapping her mirror and setting it upon the table, where its silver surface caught and reflected the light of every flame in the hall. "We must look with clear sight, beyond the veils of distance and deception, and see our brothers as they truly are." The mirror's surface began to shimmer, and in its depths visions formed. Not the fragmentary glimpses they had seen in the crystal tree, but images sharp and clear as memory itself. They saw the blue wizards in their current forms, standing atop a mountain that pierced the clouds like a spear thrust toward heaven. Their robes were indeed blue, but blue as the deep ocean, as the twilight sky, as the heart of flame that burns without consuming. Around them stood a host that numbered in the thousands, men of the East whose faces bore the marks of great suffering transformed into strength. They were not slaves or thralls, but warriors who had chosen to follow their leaders into darkness that others might walk in light. Their armor gleamed with inner fire, and their banners bore the sign of the secret fire worked in silver and gold. "Behold," Galadriel whispered, and her voice carried both relief and sorrow. "They are not fallen into shadow, but neither are they as they were. They have become bridges between the mortal and immortal realms, guardians who sacrifice their own peace that others might know tranquility." The vision shifted, showing the vast network of tunnels and caverns that honeycomb the deep places of the world. In those depths, things moved that made even the Balrogs seem as candle flames before the sun. Ancient servants of Morgoth who had delved ever deeper in their exile, growing in malice and power until they threatened to burst forth and devour all the world above. "Now do you see?" Gandalf said, his voice tight with understanding and horror. "This is why the blue wizards cannot return to us, why they have become what they are. They stand watch over an abyss that would swallow all Middle-earth if ever they faltered in their vigil." Glorfindel, who had faced the Balrog of Morgoth and knew the weight of ultimate sacrifice, spoke with quiet conviction. "Then we must aid them, whatever the cost. If they fall, we all fall with them." But it was Círdan who voiced the question that hung over them all like a sword suspended by a hair. "Aid them, yes, but how? The maps show lands beyond our reach, enemies beyond our understanding. What help can we give against powers that predate the awakening of the elves? Galadriel's mirror shimmered again, and in its depths they saw a great eagle flying eastward, bearing messages written in letters of flame. Behind it flew others of its kindred, and in their train came riders mounted on horses that shone like stars, messengers carrying word to every corner of Middle-earth that the time of the last battle was at hand. "The eagles will be our swift messengers," Gandalf said, understanding the significance of the vision. "And we must prepare for a war unlike any that has been fought since the music of creation first gave shape to the world. Not a war of armies and fortresses, but a war of light against darkness in its purest form." The council continued deep into the night, and when at last it ended, messengers had been dispatched to every corner of Middle-earth. To the Shire went word for Bilbo Baggins, whose courage had once unlocked the door to unexpected victory. To the halls of the Dwarf Kings went calls for axes and armor forged in the ancient fires. To the hidden realms of the elves went summons for warriors who remembered the elder days and were not afraid to face powers beyond mortal understanding. And eastward, riding upon wings of storm and starlight, flew the eagles of Manwë, bearing to the blue wizards word that their long vigil would soon be ended, not in defeat, but in the coming of such aid as had not been seen since the hosts of Valinor sailed across the sundering seas to break the power of Morgoth himself. The time of preparation had begun, and in the depths of the earth, ancient things stirred to wakefulness, sensing that their hour of freedom drew near. In the great halls beneath the lonely mountain, where gold caught the light of forge fires and rang with the music of hammers upon anvils, Thorin Oakenshield sat upon his throne and listened to words that filled his heart with both dread and fierce joy. Before him stood Balin the Wise, who had ridden hard from the grey havens, bearing a message sealed with the sign of Gandalf the Grey and marked with the urgency that comes only when the fate of the world hangs in the balance. "The deep roads stir with movement," Balin reported, his voice echoing in the vast chamber where the kings of Durin's line had held court for generations beyond count. "Our miners report sounds from the lower workings, not the scratch of pickaxe or the rumble of carts, but something else. Voices singing in the darkness, 'My Lord,' in tongues that predate the awakening of the firstborn." Thorin leaned forward on his throne, the Arkenstone gleaming upon his breast like a captive star. Around him, the great lords of the lonely mountains stood silent, their faces grim with the weight of revelation. They were warriors all, blooded in battle against orc and dragon, but the tales that Balin brought spoke of enemies against whom sword and axe might prove as useless as toys in the hands of children. "Gandalf calls for aid," the old dwarf continued, unrolling a scroll whose parchment seemed to shimmer with inner light. "Not for some petty squabble between the kingdoms of men, but for a war that will determine whether light or darkness shall reign supreme in all the circles of the world. The blue wizards have stood guard in the uttermost east for 2,000 years, holding back powers that make Smaug seem as dangerous as a garden snake. Now their strength fails, and all who serve the light must rally to their aid." Dane Ironfoot, Lord of the Iron Hills, stepped forward from his place among the council. His armor bore the scars of 100 battles, and his eyes held the hardness of one who had looked upon death and found it wanting. "And what would the Grey Wizard have us do?" march our armies into lands beyond the edge of our maps against foes we cannot name or understand. Thorin rose from his throne, the mail beneath his royal robes ringing like silver bells. Read on, Balin. Let us hear all of Gandalf's counsel before we speak of what can or cannot be done. The old dwarf's voice grew heavy with portent as he continued reading from the scroll. The enemy comes not from the east alone, but from beneath, from the deep places where Durin's Bane once dwelt, from tunnels that connect all the mountains of the world in a vast network of darkness. Even now, our spies report movement in the depths of Moria, not orcs or goblins, but things that have no names in the tongues of the free peoples. A shudder ran through the assembled dwarves, for the mention of Moria brought back memories that still burned in their hearts like unhealed wounds. It was there that Durin's Bane had awakened from its long sleep, there that the greatest of their cities had fallen to shadow and flame. If something stirred now in those accursed depths, then the danger was closer than any had dared to imagine. But there is hope, Balin continued, his voice growing stronger. The scrolls that Gandalf carries speak of weapons forged in the fires of creation, blades that can cleave shadow as easily as flesh, armor that turns aside the touch of despair itself. The knowledge exists to forge such things, but it requires the skill of the greatest smiths and the fires of the deepest forges. Thorin's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. The forges of Erebor, he breathed. The flames that burn at the heart of the mountain, where my forefathers wrought wonders that have not been equaled since the elder days. Dane nodded slowly, comprehension dawning in his weathered features. Aye, and the Iron Hills can provide the ore, metal drawn from veins so deep that they touch the very bones of the earth. If such weapons can be made, we are the ones to make them. As if summoned by their words, a great eagle appeared at the high windows of the throne room, its wings casting shadows that seemed to dance with their own inner light. Upon its leg was tied a scroll sealed with blue wax, and in its eyes was the gleam of one who bears tidings of vast import. Thorin himself stepped forward to receive the message, for he recognized in the eagle's bearing the signs of one who served powers greater than any earthly king. As he broke the seal, the parchment unrolled to reveal writing in the ancient script of the Khazad, but script that glowed with inner fire and seemed to burn itself into his vision. To Thorin Oakenshield, king under the mountain, and to all who serve the light, the message began. Greetings from Alatar and Pallando, who guard the eastern gates of the world. The hour of our greatest need is at hand. The deep roads that run beneath all mountains have become highways for the ancient darkness, and soon the enemy will pour forth from every cave and tunnel like water from a broken dam. We have held our vigil for 2,000 years, but we can hold no longer without aid. Send what help you can to the Blue Mountains, where Círdan the shipwright prepares ships to bear warriors into the uttermost east. But more than warriors, we need the work of your forges, weapons and armor wrought with the skill of the Khazad and blessed with the light of the secret fire. Time grows short, and every day of delay may be the difference between victory and the ending of all things. The message was signed with runes that seemed to shift and change as Thorin watched, reshaping themselves into the names of the blue wizards written in letters of flame. As the last word burned itself into his memory, the parchment crumbled to ash that sparkled like starlight before fading into nothingness. Silence filled the throne room for a long moment, broken only by the distant sound of hammers ringing on anvils and the whisper of wind through the corridors of the mountain. Then Thorin spoke, his voice carrying the authority of kingship and the weight of destiny. "Let the forges be lit," he commanded. "Let every smith in Erebor turn his hand to the making of weapons such as the world has not seen since the elder days. Send word to the Iron Hills and to every hall where the children of Durin dwell. We march to war not for gold or glory, but for the very survival of light in the world." Dain stepped forward, his hand upon his axe haft. "And what of Moria? If the deep roads stir with movement, should we not secure our own borders first?" Thorin's smile was grim as winter stone. "Moria shall be our proving ground," he said. "Before we sail into the uttermost east, we shall cleanse the ancient city of whatever darkness has taken root there. The children of Durin will reclaim their birthright, and in doing so, we shall seal one of the great roads that the enemy would use to flood the world with shadow." As word spread through the halls of Erebor, the great forges roared to life with flames that burned hotter than any fire since the making of the world. Smiths worked through the night, their hammers ringing in rhythm with heartbeats that pulsed with the same urgency that drove the makers of the Silmarils in the elder days. And in the depths of the mountain, where the roots of Erebor touched the bones of the earth itself, strange veins of ore began to glow with inner light. Metal that had slept since the music of creation first shaped the world, now wakening to serve in the final battle between light and darkness. The north was stirring indeed, and from the halls of the dwarves came the sound of preparation for a war that would shake the very foundations of Middle-earth. In the green heart of the Shire, where the Bywater Road wound between hedgerows thick with blackberry and wild rose, Bilbo Baggins sat in his garden at Bag End and watched the autumn leaves fall like golden coins from the great oak that had sheltered his door since before his grandfather's grandfather drew breath. The peaceful sounds of the Shire surrounded him, the distant lowing of cattle, the cheerful voices of hobbits going about their daily business, the whisper of wind through grass that had never known the tread of armies or the shadow of war. Yet for all the tranquility that enveloped him like a comfortable old coat, Bilbo felt a stirring in his heart that spoke of roads not taken and adventures yet to come. It was a feeling he had learned to recognize in the years since his return from the lonely mountain. The call of distant places and the whisper of great events moving beyond the borders of his small, safe world. "Peculiar weather we're having," he murmured to himself, setting down his teacup and gazing up at the sky, where clouds gathered in patterns that seemed to form shapes of significance, though he could not say what they might portend. Most peculiar indeed. As if summoned by his words, a great shadow passed over the garden, and Bilbo looked up to see an eagle circling overhead, not one of the local birds that occasionally troubled his chicken coop, but one of the great eagles of the mountains, its wings spanning wider than the width of his garden pond. In its talons, it carried something that glinted in the afternoon sun, and as it descended toward his door, Bilbo felt his heart begin to race with a mixture of excitement and dread. The eagle alighted on his garden gate with a grace that seemed almost ceremonial, and from its talons dropped a small silver cylinder sealed with wax that bore the mark of Gandalf the Grey. The great bird regarded Bilbo with eyes that held depths of wisdom and urgency, then launched itself skyward once more, disappearing into the gathering clouds as suddenly as it had come. Bilbo picked up the cylinder with hands that trembled only slightly. After all, he was a Baggins of Bag End, and Bagginses did not allow themselves to be overly discomposed by the arrival of mysterious messages, no matter how dramatically delivered. Yet as he broke the seal and unrolled the parchment within, he felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a cloak he had hoped never to wear again. My dear Bilbo, the message began in Gandalf's familiar script, though the letters seemed to glow with an inner light that made them difficult to look upon directly. I hope this letter finds you well and enjoying the peace of the Shire, for I fear it may be some time before such peace is possible again. Great events are stirring in the world, my friend, and I have need of your unique talents once more. Bilbo sank into his favorite garden chair, the one his mother had used for her afternoon tea, and continued reading with growing amazement and alarm. You will remember, I am sure, the tales I told you of the other Istari, my brothers who journeyed into the uttermost east in the early days of the Third Age. What I did not tell you then was the true nature of their mission, for it was a burden too great to share with one who had already given so much in service to the light. But now, the time of secrecy is ended, and all who serve the cause of good must know the truth. The Blue Wizards have stood guard for 2,000 years against powers that predate the awakening of the elves, ancient servants of Morgoth who delved deep into the earth after their master's defeat, and there grew in malice and might. Now those guardians fail, and the darkness they have held at bay threatens to burst forth and devour all the world. We must go to their aid, Bilbo, and we must go soon, or all our victories against lesser evils will prove as dust before the storm. Bilbo set down the letter for a moment and looked around his garden, seeing it as if for the first time. The roses still bloomed along his fence, their petals soft as silk and red as sunrise. His tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, ripe for the harvest. The apple tree by his gate bent low with fruit that would make excellent pies for the long winter ahead. It was a scene of such perfect domesticity that it seemed impossible to believe it could be threatened by powers beyond imagining. Yet as he watched, a shadow fell across the garden that was not cast by any cloud, and in that shadow he glimpsed, just for a moment, visions that made his blood run cold. He saw great cities in the east burning with fires that gave no light, armies of creatures that had no names marching beneath banners that hurt to look upon, and over all the sense of ancient malice awakening after eons of enforced slumber. He picked up the letter with hands that no longer trembled, for he was Bilbo Baggins, who had walked in Smaug's hall and lived to tell the tale. And there were few terrors left in the world that could truly shake him. I know what you are thinking, my dear hobbit. Gandalf's letter continued, as if the wizard could read his thoughts across the leagues that separated them. You are thinking that you are too old for such adventures, too comfortable in your retirement, too fond of your garden and your books to go gallivanting off on another quest. And in truth, I would not ask this of you if the need were not desperate beyond measure. But there is something you possess that even the mightiest of the Eldar lack, a quality that I noticed during our journey to Erebor, and have thought much upon in the years since. You have the gift of finding light in the darkest places, hope in the most hopeless circumstances. It is not magic, nor great strength, nor even courage in the common sense, but something rarer and more precious, the ability to remain unchanged by despair. The blue wizards have need of such a gift, for they have gazed too long into the abyss and begin to fear that they are becoming the very thing they fight against. They need someone who can remind them of what they fight for, not grand concepts of good and evil, but simple things. The taste of seed cake and the sound of bees humming in lavender, the pleasure of a well-tended garden and the comfort of a fire on a winter's night, the small joys that make life worth living and worth saving. Bilbo smiled despite himself, recognizing the shrewd psychology behind Gandalf's words. The wizard knew his hobbits well, knew how to appeal to both their sense of duty and their deep love for the simple pleasures of life. Yet there was truth in what Gandalf wrote. Bilbo had indeed seen things in his adventures that would have broken lesser spirits, and he had emerged from them not embittered or hardened, but somehow made more appreciative of the quiet beauties that surrounded him. I do not ask you to take up sword and shield, the letter concluded, nor to face the ancient terrors with naught but courage and a walking stick. There are others better suited to such tasks. What I ask is that you come with us to the eastern lands and be yourself, Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, who knows the value of a comfortable chair and a well-stocked pantry, who can find wonder in a flower and contentment in a well-crafted tale. We sail from the Grey Havens in 7 days' time. If you choose to come, bring only what you need for the journey and leave the rest to those who serve the greater powers. But know this, whether you come or stay, you have already given more to the cause of light than most who are counted among the great and mighty. Your friend always, Gandalf, the Grey PS. You might want to pack your mithril shirt. I have a feeling it may prove useful once again. Bilbo folded the letter carefully and sat back in his chair, watching the play of afternoon light through the leaves of his oak tree. Around him, the Shire continued its peaceful routine, unaware of the great darkness gathering in the east or the desperate mission that was being planned to oppose it. 7 days. 7 days to decide whether to leave behind everything he had built and won and go once more into the wide world beyond the borders of his safe, green land. 7 days to choose between the comfort of home and the call of duty that he had hoped never to hear again. But as he sat there in his garden, surrounded by the fruits of his labor and the evidence of a life well lived, Bilbo Baggins felt something stirring in his heart that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. It was the same feeling that had driven him from Bag End so many years ago. Not the call of adventure, but something deeper and more fundamental. It was love. Love for the small, precious things that made life worth living. Love for the friends who had shared his journeys, and love for the world itself with all its beauty and wonder and infinite possibility. He rose from his chair and walked to the gate where the eagle had alighted, looking out along the bywater road that led eventually to all the roads of the world. Somewhere beyond the horizon, his friends were preparing for a battle that would determine the fate of all he held dear. "Well then," he said to the empty air, his voice carrying the quiet determination that had once impressed a dragon and amazed a company of dwarves. 7 days to pack. I suppose I'd better get started. And with that, Bilbo Baggins went inside to begin preparations for what might well be his final adventure. Not because duty demanded it, but because love required it. And there were some calls that even the most contented hobbit could not ignore. The Grey Havens had not seen such a gathering since the last ships of the Eldar sailed into the west, bearing the final remnants of the Elder Days beyond the circles of the world. Now the ancient harbour bustled with activity that spoke not of endings, but of beginnings, the commencement of a venture that would either save Middle-earth or witness its final destruction in darkness absolute. Ships rode at anchor in the bay, their sails furled but ready, their hulls carved from wood that had grown in the light of the two trees and blessed with songs that could turn aside both storm and shadow. At their prows stood figureheads wrought in the likeness of eagles and swans, their eyes bright with captured starlight, their beaks and wings spread as if to bear their vessels beyond the boundaries of mortal sight. Upon the longest pier stood Círdan the shipwright, his hair silver as sea foam, and his eyes deep as the waters that had borne Eärendil to the shores of Valinor. Around him moved the greatest craftsmen of his people, preparing provisions and supplies for a journey into lands where no ship of the Eldar had ever sailed. Food that would not spoil in 1,000 years, water drawn from springs that remembered the music of creation, weapons and armor forged in the fires of heaven itself. All these and more were loaded into the holds with the care of those who knew that failure might mean the ending of all things. The tides will turn at dawn, Círdan reported to the small council that had gathered in his tower overlooking the harbour. If we are to sail with the blessing of the waters, we must depart with the morning light. Gandalf stood at the window, his grey robe stirring in the salt breeze, his eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon where darkness gathered like a storm that would never break. In his hands, he held one of the scrolls retrieved from Gil-galad's hidden chamber, its ancient script glowing softly in the lamplight as he studied the maps and diagrams that would guide them to their destination. "The route is perilous," he said, tracing with his finger the course marked upon the parchment. "We must sail first to the Bay of Foroshel, then eastward along the ice-clad shores where the great bergs drift like floating mountains. From there, the maps speak of a river that flows northward from the Sea of Rhûn, a river whose waters run backwards, defying the natural order of things. Elrond, who had come from Rivendell with a company of his most trusted knights, leaned over the map with brows furrowed in concern. A river that flows backward speaks of sorcery, he said. What power could turn the very waters from their course? It was Galadriel who answered, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge gained through long communion with her mirror. The same power that holds back the ancient darkness, she said. The blue wizards have wrought changes in the very fabric of the world, bending the elements to serve their need. The river flows northward because they have commanded it to do so, creating a passage through which aid might come to them in their hour of greatest need. Bilbo Baggins sat in a corner of the chamber, looking somewhat out of place among the tall figures of the Eldar, but no less determined for all that. His pack lay at his feet, carefully arranged with all the necessities for a long journey, and his mithril shirt gleamed softly beneath his travelling coat. He had said little since his arrival at the Havens, but his eyes held the steady light of one who had made his choice and would not be turned aside. "And what of the others?" Glorfindel asked, entering the chamber with news from the wider world. "What word from Erebor and the halls of the dwarves?" Gandalf's face brightened somewhat at the question. "Thorin sends word that the forges burn bright and the weapons are nearly ready. Axes and swords wrought with the skill of the Khazad and blessed with light that can cleave shadows as easily as flesh. But more than that, he has decided to march upon Moria before sailing east. If the deep roads are compromised, then the ancient city must be cleansed before it can serve as a highway for the enemy." A great eagle appeared at the window as he spoke, its wings casting shadows that danced with their own inner light. Upon its leg was tied a message cylinder, and in its eyes was the urgency of one who bears tidings of great import. Círdan stepped forward to receive the message, his fingers steady despite the weight of years as he broke the seal and unrolled the parchment within. "From Gwaihir, Lord of the Eagles," he read aloud. "The enemy stirs in all the deep places. Creatures move in the tunnels beneath Weathertop, and strange lights are seen in the depths of the misty mountains. But stranger still, the very stones themselves seem to sing, as if responding to some great call from the uttermost east." Galadriel rose from her chair, her face pale as moonlight. "The time grows short," she said. "The network of power that the blue wizards have woven begins to resonate like a harp string pulled too tight. Soon it will either hold or snap, and if it snaps—" She did not need to finish the thought. All present could imagine what would happen if the barriers that held back the ancient darkness suddenly failed. The flood of malice that would pour forth from every cave and tunnel, the corruption that would spread across the world like plague, the ending of all light and hope beneath a tide of shadow that knew no mercy. "Then we sail at dawn," Gandalf declared, rolling up the scroll with hands that betrayed no tremor despite the magnitude of what they faced. "The ships are provisioned, the course is set, and delay serves only the enemy. Let word go forth to all who serve the light. The time of the last battle has come." As the night deepened over the grey havens, the final preparations were completed. Elves moved like shadows through the harbour, checking rigging and testing the strength of masts that would bear them across seas unknown. Weapons were distributed, not the swords and spears of mortal warfare, but blades forged in the fires of creation that could cleave the very essence of shadow, and shields blessed with light that could turn aside despair itself. In the houses of the harbour, those who would remain behind gathered to bid farewell to friends and kinsmen who might never return. Songs were sung that had not been heard since the elder days, laments for the passing of ages, hymns of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness, and war chants that spoke of glory found in sacrifice and light preserved through shadow. Bilbo stood upon the deck of the largest ship, the Vindilotes Hope, named in honor of Eärendil's vessel that had borne the Silmaril to the halls of the Valar. Around him, the preparations continued with the quiet efficiency of those who knew their task and would not be deterred from it. Yet for all the activity that surrounded him, the hobbit found his thoughts turning to the garden he had left behind, to the roses that would bloom unwatered and the apple tree that would drop its fruit ungathered. "Second thoughts, my dear fellow?" Gandalf asked, appearing beside him with the silent step of one who had walked many roads and learned to move without disturbing even the dust beneath his feet. Bilbo smiled, though his eyes remained fixed upon the horizon where the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "No second thoughts," he said quietly. "Only the recognition that some things, once begun, cannot be undone. We sail toward a fate that none can foresee, into lands where the very air may be poison to those raised in the gentle climes of the west." "And yet you do not falter," Gandalf observed. "No," Bilbo replied, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had once impressed a dragon and amazed a company of dwarves. "I do not falter, for if we fail, then all gardens will wither, all roses will fade, and all the small beauties that make life worth living will be consumed by darkness. Better to sail into the unknown than to sit safe at home and watch the world end from a comfortable chair." As the first rays of dawn touched the waters of the bay, Círdan gave the signal to cast off. The great ships moved slowly from their moorings, their sails filling with wind that carried the scent of distant shores and the promise of adventures yet to come. Upon their decks stood the last hope of Middle-earth, wizard and elf, hobbit and the finest warriors of the free peoples, sailing into the uttermost east to aid their brothers in what might well be the final battle against the darkness that had plagued the world since its making. Behind them, the grey havens grew small in the distance, their lights twinkling like fallen stars upon the shore. Ahead lay the vast expanse of the sea, and beyond that, lands where no ship of the West had ever sailed, and powers dwelt that predated the awakening of the world. The plan was set in motion, and there could be no turning back. Far from the grey waters where the ships of the Eldar cut their wake through foam and spray, in the depths of the lonely mountain, where the fires of creation still burned in the heart of the world, something stirred that had slept since the forging of the first ring of power. The great dragon Smaug was dead, his bones scattered upon the desolate shores of Long Lake. But the mountain that had been his lair for so many years remembered still the touch of fire and the weight of ancient malice. Now, as the hammers of the dwarves rang in rhythm with the pulse of approaching war, the mountain itself began to wake, not with the greedy consciousness of the dragon, but with something older and more terrible, the memory of Morgoth's power, the echo of darkness that had touched every corner of Middle-earth in the Elder Days and left its mark upon stone and metal, fire and shadow. In the lowest halls of Erebor, where even the dwarves rarely ventured, the veins of mithril began to glow with light that was not entirely wholesome. The precious metal, so long dark and cold, now pulsed with radiance that spoke not of purity, but of transformation. Silver shot through with threads of blue flame that writhed like living things in the depths of the rock. Thorin Oakenshield felt it first as he stood in the great forge chamber, watching his smiths labor over weapons that would arm the expedition to the east. The Arkenstone upon his breast, that gem which was the heart of the mountain and the soul of his kingship, began to grow warm against his chest, its light shifting from the pure white radiance he had always known to something deeper, more complex. Light shot through with colors that had no names in any tongue of Middle-earth. "My lord," called Balin from the entrance to the chamber, his voice tight with concern and wonder. "You must come. Something stirs in the deep places, something that our miners dare not name." Thorin followed the old dwarf through corridors that grew stranger with each step they took downward. The walls, carved from living rock by the hands of his ancestors, now bore veins of light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The air itself seemed thick with power, and with each breath he drew, he felt something changing within him. Not corruption, but awakening, as if the very blood in his veins remembered songs that had been sung before the sun first rose. They came at last to a vast chamber that Thorin had never seen before, though he had walked these halls since childhood and thought he knew every tunnel and cavern in the mountain. It was circular, its walls rising into darkness that no torch could penetrate, and at its center stood something that made both dwarves catch their breath in amazement and terror. It was an anvil, but an anvil such as had not been seen since the music of creation first gave shape to the world. Carved from a single block of stone that seemed to contain within it all the colors of fire, it stood twice the height of a man and blazed with inner light that cast no shadows. Around its base, runes were carved that hurt to look upon directly, not the script of the Khazad, nor of the Eldar, nor of any people that walked beneath the sky, but the very words of power that the Valar had spoken when they shaped the foundations of the earth. "What is it?" Balin whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the anvil's song, for it did sing, a deep harmonic that seemed to resonate in the bones of the mountain itself. Thorin stepped closer, drawn by a power he could not name or resist. As he approached, the Arkenstone's light grew brighter, and in its radiance he saw visions that made his warrior's heart both soar and tremble. He saw the forges of Aule the smith in the Undying Lands, where the first weapons of light had been wrought in the dawn of time. He saw the making of the Silmarils, those holy jewels that had contained within them the light of the two trees. And he saw, strangest of all, two figures in blue robes standing before this very anvil in ages past, their faces bright with purpose as they forged something that blazed with such radiance that the vision itself could not contain it. "The forge of stars," he breathed, understanding flooding through him like fire through dry tinder. The legends spoke truth. It lies not in the halls of the Valar, but here, in the heart of Erebor, waiting for the hour of greatest need. As if summoned by his words, figures began to appear around the chamber, not living beings, but memories made manifest, echoes of all who had stood in this place when the world was younger and the barriers between the seen and unseen were not so fixed. Thorin saw his ancestors, the kings of old who had ruled in Erebor before the coming of the dragon, and with them others whose faces he knew from legend but had never thought to see. Aule himself, mightiest of the Valar after Manwë, standing beside the anvil with hammer raised, and stranger still, the darkness of Morgoth as he had been before his fall, his face dark with the shadow of destruction, his hands shaping horrors that would outlast the ending of the world. "The darkness corrupts," spoke a voice that seemed to come from the very stones of the mountain, "but it does not destroy. What was made in light remains light, though shadow may obscure it for an age of the world." The visions faded, leaving only Thorin and Balin standing before the impossible anvil, their eyes wide with the weight of revelation. But the chamber was not empty. Upon the anvil's surface lay tools that gleamed with inner fire, and beside them metal such as neither dwarf had ever seen, not mithril, nor gold, nor even the silver of the elves, but something that seemed to contain within it the essence of starlight itself. "We are to forge weapons here," Thorin said, his voice heavy with awe and understanding. not just arms for mortal warfare, but blades that can cleave the very essence of shadow, armor that can turn aside despair itself. The blue wizards did not call us to the east merely to fight. They called us to create. Balin nodded slowly, his aged eyes reflecting the light of the anvil. But who among us has the skill to work such wonders? The craft of the Forge of Stars was lost when the world was young. Even as he spoke, the answer came, not in words, but in knowledge that flowed into their minds like water into a drought-stricken land. They saw the techniques of the elder days, the songs that must be sung while the metal was shaped, the prayers that must be offered to powers greater than any earthly king. It was dangerous knowledge, for it came with the understanding that once begun, the work could not be stopped. They would forge until the task was done, or the mountain itself crumbled beneath the weight of such power unleashed. "Send word to every smith in Erebor," Thorin commanded, his voice carrying the authority of kingship touched by destiny. "Tell them to come to the depths, to the chamber that was hidden until this hour. We have work to do, work that will either save the world or destroy us in the attempting." As word spread through the halls of the lonely mountain, the dwarves came in wonder and trepidation to the chamber of the Forge of Stars. They brought with them their finest tools, their greatest skill, and their unshakable determination to serve the light in whatever way their craft demanded. But they brought also something else, the knowledge, passed down through generations in whispered legends, that the greatest works of creation required the greatest sacrifices. Not all who labored at the Forge of Stars would live to see their work completed, for the making of weapons that could cleave shadow itself demanded payment in the coin that mattered most. Yet as they took up their hammers and prepared to begin the greatest work of their lives, none faltered. They were the children of Aula, heirs to the tradition of creation that stretched back to the music of the Ainur itself. If the world required weapons forged in starfire, then starfire weapons it would have, whatever the cost. The fire awakened, and in its awakening, the fate of all Middle-earth trembled in the balance. In the shadow of the Eiffel Duath, where the mountains of shadow cast their darkness across the plateau of Gorgoroth, something stirred that had waited in patience for more years than the memory of men could encompass. It was not Sauron, though his fortress of Barad-dûr rose like a black needle against the poisoned sky, and it was not any servant of the Dark Lord, though orcs scuttled through the tunnels beneath the mountains, like ants in a disturbed nest. It was older than both, older than the kingdom of Númenor, older than the kingdoms of Gil-galad and Elendil, older, perhaps, than the very stones upon which the Black Gate was built. In the deepest vaults beneath Mount Doom, where the fires of the earth burned with heat that could melt the very foundations of the world, something that had slept since the fall of Morgoth began to stir to wakefulness. The Nazgûl felt it first as they rode their fell beasts through the ash-choked air above Mordor. Their wraith senses, attuned to every current of malice and despair that flowed through the Dark Lord's realm, detected a disturbance in the fabric of shadow itself, not weakening, but gathering, as if all the scattered fragments of some great power were drawing together after eons of separation. The Witch King of Angmar, greatest and most terrible of the nine, descended from his flight to the courtyard of Barad-dûr, where his master waited with the patience of one who had orchestrated the movements of nations for thousands of years. Yet even Sauron, mightiest of the Maiar, who had followed Morgoth into darkness, seemed troubled by what stirred in the depths below his own stronghold. "My lord," the Witch King spoke, his voice like the whisper of wind through graveyards. "Something wakes in the deep places, something that was not there when last I walked these halls." Sauron turned from the great window that looked out over his domain, his form wreathed in shadow that seemed to absorb light rather than cast it. His eyes, burning with malice that had festered for ages beyond count, fixed upon his servant with interest that spoke of possibilities both welcome and feared. "I know," the Dark Lord replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very stones of Barad-dûr ring like struck bells. "I have felt its stirring, its slow awakening from the sleep that my master's defeat imposed upon it. The question that concerns me is not what wakes, but why it wakes now, in this hour when my own power grows toward its culmination." He gestured toward the east, where beyond the sea of Rune and the vast lands that lay shrouded in mystery, lights were said to dance on the horizon that spoke of powers opposed to his dominion. The blue wizards gather strength in the uttermost east, and their light begins to burn with such intensity that even I can feel its heat across the leagues that separate us. Perhaps their efforts have disturbed forces that were meant to remain undisturbed. The Witch King's hollow laugh was like the sound of wind through empty armor. Or perhaps those same forces seek to ally themselves with us, my lord. Not all who served the first Dark Lord were destroyed when Angband fell. Some fled, some hid. Some waited for the hour when their master's heir would have need of their service. But Sauron's expression, hidden though it was beneath veils of shadow, spoke of doubt rather than confidence. In all his long years of planning and preparation, in all his careful orchestration of the events that would lead to his dominion over Middle-earth, there had been no place for powers beyond his control. Yet now, in the very heart of his stronghold, something stirred that he had not summoned, had not commanded, had not even known existed. "Come," he said to the Witch King, his voice carrying the authority of one who had learned to command even the forces of creation itself. "We descend to the deep places. If there is power waking in the roots of Mount Doom, then I would look upon it with my own eyes and judge whether it serves my purposes or opposes them." They descended through passages carved from living rock, past chambers where the fires of the earth burned without fuel, and the very air shimmered with heat that could melt the bones of lesser beings. The way led ever downward, through layers of stone that remembered the making of the world, past caverns where the echoes of the music of creation still lingered like half-forgotten melodies. At last, they came to a vast chamber that neither had seen before, though both had walked the depths of Mount Doom for centuries, beyond count. It was circular, its walls rising into darkness that seemed to swallow even Sauron's piercing gaze. And at its center stood something that made even the Dark Lord pause in wonder and growing unease. It was a blade, but a blade such as had not been seen since the elder days when the Valar themselves had walked upon Middle-earth, forged from metal that seemed to contain within it all the colors of darkness, not black, but every hue that lay beyond the spectrum of mortal sight. It stood upright in a block of stone that had been shaped by no earthly hand. Its edge was keen enough to cleave shadows, its surface inscribed with runes that hurt to look upon directly, even for eyes that had gazed upon the flame imperishable and remembered still its burning. "Gurthang," Sauron whispered, and in the speaking of that name, the very air grew thick with power and dread. The iron of death, which was broken upon the body of Glaurung the Golden and lost when Beleriand sank beneath the waves. How comes it here, in the depths of my own stronghold? The answer came not in words, but in visions that played out upon the walls of the chamber. Images of the sword's making in the fires of Morgoth's forge, of its wielding by Turin Turambar in the wars against the dragons, of its shattering and the scattering of its fragments across all the world. Yet some of those fragments had survived, drawn by powers beyond understanding to this place where the fires of creation burned brightest, and here they had slowly, patiently reformed themselves into the weapon they had always been meant to be. "It waits," the Witch King observed, his voice carrying notes of hunger and anticipation. "But waits for what? For whom?" Sauron approached the blade with steps that echoed strangely in the vast chamber, each footfall seeming to resonate with harmonics that spoke of destiny approaching its culmination. As he drew near, the runes upon Gurthang's surface began to glow with light that was not light, darkness made visible, shadow given form and purpose. He reached out his hand towards the weapon's hilt, but stopped before his fingers could touch the ancient metal. For in that moment of approach, he felt something that he had not experienced since his master's fall: uncertainty. The blade radiated power, yes, but it was not a power that acknowledged his authority. It was older, stranger, carrying within it echoes of the music of creation that had shaped the world before even the Ainur had descended to walk upon its surface. "It does not wait for me," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of recognition and something that might have been fear. "It waits for another, one whose coming was foretold in the songs that were sung before the making of the sun and moon." He stepped back from the weapon, his shadow-wreathed form seeming to diminish slightly in the presence of the ancient blade. "Let it remain here, untouched and undrawn. Whatever power forged it anew in these depths, whatever purpose it serves in the greater song that plays out across the world, it is not for us to wield, not for us to command." The Witch King's hollow laugh echoed in the chamber. "My lord grows cautious in his hour of approaching victory." "No," Sauron replied, his voice carrying the weight of ages and the wisdom born of defeat. "I grow wise. There are powers in this world that predate my master and will outlast us both. This blade is one such power, and wisdom counsels that some weapons are too dangerous even for the Dark Lord of Mordor to claim. They ascended from the depths, leaving Gurthang to its vigil in the darkness, but the knowledge of its presence lingered like a weight upon Sauron's mind. In the east, the blue wizards gathered strength for what might be the final battle between light and shadow. In the north, the forges of Erebor blazed with fires that could forge weapons from starlight itself. And here, in the very heart of his own stronghold, a blade waited that might tip the balance in directions that no prophecy had foretold. The game was vast, the players many, and the stakes higher than any single power, no matter how great, could hope to control. In the depths of Mount Doom, Gurthang waited in patient silence, its edge keen enough to cut the threads of fate itself, while above, in the poisoned air of Mordor, the Dark Lord contemplated possibilities that filled even his ancient heart with something approaching dread. The blade was not yet drawn, but its time was coming, and when it came, the world would be changed in ways that no power of light or darkness could foresee. The gates of Moria had stood sealed for more than 1,000 years, their massive doors of mithril and steel barred against the darkness that had consumed the greatest city of the dwarves. Now, as the sound of marching feet echoed through the valley of the Mirrormere, those gates trembled upon their hinges as if sensing the approach of those who had the right to open them once more. Thorin Oakenshield rode at the head of a host such as had not been seen since the days of the last alliance, not an army of conquest, but a company of reclamation. Behind him marched the flower of dwarvish valor, warriors from Erebor and the Iron Hills, the Blue Mountains and the far Grey Mountains, united for the first time in an age under the banner of Durin's heir. Their armor gleamed with light that was not entirely of this world, for much of it had been forged in the depths of the Lonely Mountain, using techniques learned at the Forge of Stars. At Thorin's side rode Dane Ironfoot, his warhammer wreathed in flames that cast no heat but could cleave through shadow as easily as steel through silk. Behind them came the greatest smiths and warriors of their people, each bearing weapons that had been blessed with light from the secret fire itself, axes that could split the very essence of darkness, shields that could turn aside despair, and armor that made its wearers proof against the touch of corruption. But it was not weapons alone that made this host mighty. In the supply trains that followed, the warriors came something that had not been seen since the Elder days: the portable forges of the Khazad, furnaces that could burn without fuel, and anvils that could shape starlight into steel. For Thorin had learned in the depths of Erebor that the battle to come would be won not by sword and axe alone, but by the power to create in the face of destruction, to forge light where darkness sought to reign supreme. As they approached the gates of Moria, the very air seemed to thicken with memory and sorrow. This had been Khazad-dûm, the Dworodelf, mightiest of all the mansions of the Khazad, where the light of the Silmarils had once shone in halls carved from living rock. Here Durin the Deathless had established his kingdom, and here his heirs had ruled in splendor until the shadow came and the Balrog woke from its long sleep in the deeps. The gates themselves were a wonder to behold, even in their centuries of closure, wrought of mithril and traced with it Hildin, that caught and held the light of moon and stars. They bore upon their surface the device of Durin's crown and the hammer and anvil of his house. Above them, carved in letters of silver that still gleamed despite the passing years, were written the words that every child of Durin knew by heart. The doors of Durin, Lord of Moria, speak, friend, and enter. But as Thorin approached the gates, he found that the ancient riddle had changed. The Ithildin letters shifted and reformed before his eyes, taking on new shapes that spelled out words in the deep tongue of the Khazad. The doors of Durin await the heir who bears starfire. Speak, kinsman, and reclaim. Thorin stepped forward, the Arkenstone blazing upon his breast like a captive star, and spoke the word that had been given to him in the depths of Erebor, in the chamber where the Forge of Stars had revealed its secrets. Khazad I Menu. The dwarves are coming home. The great doors swung open with a sound like thunder rolling through mountain valleys, and beyond them stretched the vast halls of Moria, no longer shrouded in darkness, but filled with a strange blue-tinged radiance that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. The shadow was gone, fled or destroyed, and in its place was something that made every dwarf in the company catch his breath in wonder. The halls were not empty. Throughout the vast spaces of the Dworodelf, figures moved in robes of many colours, not the hooded servants they had glimpsed at Dol Guldur, but dwarves, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, working at forges that blazed with light from the secret fire. Their faces were gaunt with long labour and marked by sorrows that had aged them beyond their years, but their eyes held the same light that burned in the halls of Erebor when the great work had begun. "Who are they?" Dain whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of hammers ringing on anvils and the songs that rose from the throats of the workers, songs in the deep tongue of the Khazad, but songs that spoke of hope rather than sorrow, of building rather than mourning. The answer came from a figure who emerged from the shadows near the great entrance, tall for a dwarf, his beard white as mountain snow, his eyes bright with wisdom and welcome. It was Balin, but not as Thorin had ever seen him. His form was translucent, shot through with the same blue radiance that filled the halls, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that spoke of realms beyond the circles of the world. "Welcome, cousin," he said, and his smile was radiant with joy that transcended the boundaries of life and death. "Welcome to Khazad Dûm Reborn, where the children of Aula work as they worked in the elder days, forging weapons for the final battle between light and darkness." Thorin stepped forward, his heart heavy with questions and wonder. "Balin, but how can this be? You are with us still, in the halls of Erebor, planning the great work." The spectral dwarf's laugh was like the sound of silver bells in mountain valleys. "I am indeed with you there, cousin, as I am here, as I am in all the places where the children of Durin labour in service to the light. The barriers between the worlds grow thin in these days of approaching doom, and those who serve the secret fire find that their spirits are not bound by the limitations of flesh alone." He gestured toward the vast halls where the ghostly dwarves continued their work, their hammers ringing in rhythm with heartbeats that pulsed across all the world. "These are the spirits of all who died in Moria when the shadow came, not lost, not destroyed, but transformed into servants of the light. They have waited here through all the dark years, holding the halls against the return of shadow, preparing for the day when their king would come home and the great work could begin in earnest." As Thorin and his company moved deeper into the reclaimed halls, they saw wonders that defied understanding. The forges blazed with flames that gave light but no heat, fueled by the will of those who tended them. The anvils rang with sounds that resonated in dimensions beyond the physical world, and the weapons that were being forged, axes and swords, spears and shields, blazed with light that could cleave the very essence of shadow. "This is why we could not return to Moria while the shadow held sway," Balin explained, his translucent form walking beside Thorin through halls that had once echoed with the laughter of living dwarves. The spirits of the dead could not rest while darkness ruled in the halls of their fathers. But now, with the great work beginning and the final battle approaching, they are free to serve as they could not serve in life. They came at last to the great chamber where the throne of Durin stood, carved from a single block of mithril that caught and reflected light in patterns that spoke of infinite possibility. Upon its arms rested weapons that made even the mightiest blades forged in Erebor seem as toys by comparison. A hammer that could shatter mountains, an axe that could cleave the foundations of the world, and strangest of all, a crown wrought of starlight itself, waiting for the heir who would wear it in the final battle. "Take up your inheritance, King under the mountain," Balin said, his voice carrying the authority of ages and the weight of destiny. "Take up the crown of Durin the Deathless and lead your people, both living and dead, to the victory that has been foretold since the music of creation first gave shape to the world." Thorin approached the throne with steps that echoed strangely in the vast chamber, each footfall seeming to resonate with the heartbeat of the mountain itself. As he lifted the crown of starlight, he felt the weight of all the ages pressing upon him, the responsibility of kingship, the burden of leadership, and something more, the knowledge that he stood at the center of events that would determine the fate of all the world. He placed the crown upon his brow, and as he did, light blazed forth from every surface in the great hall. The spectral dwarves raised their voices in songs of triumph. The living warriors knelt in homage to their king. And throughout all the vast halls of Moria, the sound of hammers ringing on anvils grew to a crescendo that could be heard in the depths of the earth and the heights of the sky. The kingdom was reclaimed, but more than that, it was transformed, made into something greater than it had ever been before. From this stronghold, weapons would flow that could arm the hosts of light in their final battle against the ancient darkness. From these halls, the light of the secret fire would shine forth to guide all who serve the cause of good. And in the east, beyond the Sea of Rune and the mountains that marked the edge of the world, two figures in blue robes felt the surge of hope and strength that flowed from the renewed kingdom of the Khazad, and knew that aid was coming at last to their long vigil in the darkness. In the depths of the Gladden fields, where the waters of Anduin whispered secrets to the reeds and willows, there lay hidden a thing of such malice and power that even the earth itself seemed to shun it. Beneath mud and stone, wrapped in darkness that no light had touched for long years, the One Ring of Sauron waited with a patience that was more terrible than wrath. Gandalf stood upon the riverbank, his grey robe stirring in the wind that came down from the distant mountains. His eyes, usually bright with inner fire, were shadowed with a knowledge that sat heavy upon his heart. The victory over the Blue Wizards had been won, but it was a victory that tasted of ash and sorrow. For in their defeat, he had seen a truth that chilled him to his very bones. "The ring," he whispered to the rushing water. "The ring remembers its master." He had felt it in the moment when Alatar's corruption was finally broken, a stirring in the deep places of the world, as though some great sleeper had turned in its dreams. The malice of the Blue Wizards had been but a shadow of a greater darkness, and their fall had sent ripples through the spiritual realm that touched upon powers better left undisturbed. The wizard closed his eyes and let his senses reach out across the waters, feeling for the source of that cold presence he had sensed. There, beneath the surface, where the bones of ancient kings lay scattered and forgotten, he felt it, a circle of gold that pulsed with malevolent life, growing stronger with each passing year as its master's power waxed in the east. Not yet, Gandalf murmured, opening his eyes to gaze across the water. But the time approaches when even thy hiding place shall be no sanctuary. He thought of Bilbo Baggins, safe in his hobbit hole in the Shire, unknowing of the great currents of darkness that swirled about Middle-earth. The little fellow had played his part in the defeat of Smaug, as Gandalf had hoped, but greater trials lay ahead. The wizard could see them approaching like storm clouds on the horizon, days when the smallest folk would bear the greatest burdens, and when the fate of all free peoples would hang upon the choices made in quiet moments by those who thought themselves powerless. A fish leaped in the water, sending ripples across the surface, and for a moment, Gandalf imagined he saw golden fire glinting in the depths. The ring was calling, as it had called to Isildur long ago. It would call to others before the end, and not all would have the strength to resist its voice. The wizard turned away from the water and began to walk back toward the path that would take him west, toward the Shire and the green hills where innocence still dwelt. There were plans to be made and guardians to be set in place. The ring might sleep for now, but Gandalf knew that its dreams were growing darker, and that the day would come when it would wake and seek to return to its master's hand. Behind him, the Anduin flowed on toward the sea, carrying with it the sorrows and secrets of ages past, and in its depths, a golden circle pulsed with patient malice, counting the heartbeats of the world and waiting for its time to come. The cleansing of Dol Guldur came not with the crash of thunder or the blaze of lightning, but with a silence that was deeper than any darkness. When Gandalf and the White Council at last stormed the stronghold that had been the necromancer's seat, they found only empty halls and cold stone, as though evil itself had simply chosen to depart. Saruman the White stood in Sarn, what had once been the chamber of the Dark Lord's lieutenant, his staff glowing with pale light that revealed nothing but bare walls and scattered dust. "He is gone," the head of the council pronounced, his voice echoing strangely in the hollow space. "The shadow has withdrawn." But Gandalf, walking slowly through the ruins with Elrond at his side, felt no relief at these words. The grey wizard's eyes were troubled as he gazed upon the empty throne, where once a figure of terrible power had sat and woven webs of darkness across the world. The stone itself seemed to remember that presence, and in its remembering, Gandalf read a truth that filled him with foreboding. "Withdrawn, yes," he said quietly, so that only Elrond might hear. "But not defeated. Never think it defeated." The Lord of Rivendell nodded gravely, his own ancient wisdom recognizing what Saruman, in his pride, seemed unwilling to acknowledge. Evil such as they had faced here did not simply vanish when confronted. It flowed like shadow before light, seeking new channels, new vessels, new ways to work its will upon the world. Galadriel appeared beside them, her presence bringing a warmth that the cold stones seemed to drink greedily. "I have looked into the depths of this place," she said, her voice like silver bells in the darkness. "The corruption runs deeper than stone and mortar. It has touched the very roots of the earth, and what has been touched is not easily cleansed." As if to confirm her words, a wind arose from the depths of the fortress, carrying with it a scent of distant fires and the sound of marching feet. Somewhere far to the east, beyond the Sea of Rune and the lands that maps did not show, something stirred. The necromancer had not been destroyed. He had merely returned to his true stronghold, to the black tower that stood in the heart of Mordor, like a cancerous growth upon the world. Sauron, Gandalf spoke, the name that others feared to utter, and it seemed to hang in the air like a curse. He was never truly here, only his lieutenant, his shadow cast far from its source. And now even that shadow has returned to trouble us no more from this place. Saruman's head turned sharply at the name, and for a moment something flickered in his pale eyes. Fear, perhaps, or ambition, or both mingled together. The enemy was defeated long ago, he said firmly. What we faced here was but a remnant, an echo of ancient malice. But Gandalf did not answer, for he was listening to sounds that only he could hear, the whisper of wings in the high places of the air, the distant roar of furnaces being rekindled, the rhythmic beat of hammers shaping instruments of war. The necromancer's withdrawal from Dol Guldur was not retreat, but strategy, a gathering of power for a stroke that would shake the very foundations of Middle-earth. They left that place as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the empty towers red as blood. The fortress stood silent and abandoned. Its purpose served. It had been a watching post, a forward position from which the enemy could observe and influence the affairs of the free peoples. Now it was no longer needed, for the time of watching was nearly done, and the time of war drew near. As they descended the winding path that led away from the hill of Dol Guldur, Gandalf looked back once at the dark silhouette against the sky. "Sleep well, stones of sorrow," he murmured. "Your rest has been long earned. But know that greater shadows than any you have housed are stirring in the east, and the peace you have found may not endure." In the grey hour before dawn, when the world stands balanced between night and day, Gandalf the Grey sat beside a small fire in the wild lands east of the misty mountains. The flames danced low and steady, casting flickering shadows on the wizard's weathered face as he gazed into the depths of the coals. Around him, the vast silence of the wilderness stretched away in all directions, broken only by the whisper of wind through grass and the distant call of some night bird greeting the coming day. The defeat of the Blue Wizards lay weeks behind him now, but still their final words echoed in his memory. "The small hands," Alatar had said with his dying breath. His eyes cleared at last of the madness that had claimed him. In the end, it will be the small hands that bear the greatest burden. And Pallando, freed from corruption in those final moments, had whispered of a golden circle hidden in dark water, waiting for its time to come. Gandalf drew deeply on his pipe, the smoke rising like a prayer into the pale sky. He had walked long roads in his years upon Middle-earth, had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of stars, but never had he felt the weight of time so heavily as he did now, in this quiet moment when the fate of all free peoples seemed to hang upon choices not yet made, roads not yet taken. To the west lay the Shire, where hobbits tended their gardens and told their stories, blissfully unaware of the darkness gathering beyond their borders. Bilbo Baggins would be stirring soon in his hobbit hole, perhaps brewing his morning tea and thinking of the dragon's gold that now filled the halls under the mountain. The little fellow had no notion of the greater treasure that lay hidden in his waistcoat pocket, the golden ring he had claimed as his share of the adventure, a ring that pulsed with patient malice and waited for its master's call. "The small hands," Gandalf murmured again, and for a moment he saw them clearly, not the hands of kings or warriors, but the gentle fingers of folk who had never held a sword, who measured their days in harvests and seasons rather than in victories and defeats. It would be such hands, he knew now, with the certainty of prophecy, that would determine whether light or shadow would triumph in the end. The fire crackled and settled, sending up a shower of sparks that glowed like tiny stars before fading into the growing light. Somewhere to the east, beyond the bounds of maps and the knowledge of the wise, the Dark Lord was stirring in his stronghold, gathering his strength for the war that was to come. Armies would march, cities would burn, and the great ones of the earth would fall like leaves before the storm. But hope, Gandalf knew, did not lie in armies or in the strength of the mighty. It lay in the courage of the small, in the light that burned in ordinary hearts when all other lights had failed. The Shire folk, with their love of growing things and their simple pleasures, carried within them a power that Sauron could never understand. The power of life itself, stubborn and enduring and bright with an inner fire that no darkness could extinguish. The wizard rose and scattered the ashes of his fire, watching them drift away on the morning breeze. Soon he would take the road west, toward the green hills and safe harbors. There were preparations to be made, guardians to be set in place, and most important of all, friendships to be kindled that would burn bright in the darkness to come. As he shouldered his pack and took up his staff, Gandalf allowed himself a small smile. The blue wizards were gone, yes, and their passing had revealed the depth of the shadow that threatened the world. But it had also revealed something else, that even in the heart of corruption, the light of Eru could not be wholly extinguished. As long as small hands were willing to bear great burdens, as long as simple folk were ready to walk into darkness for the sake of others, hope would endure. The sun broke free of the mountains, painting the world in gold and rose, and Gandalf the Grey walked on toward whatever destiny awaited him, carrying in his heart the certain knowledge that the smallest light can pierce the deepest darkness, and that, in the end, it is not the mighty who save the world, but the humble who choose to act when action is needed most.